can open the door.
I have been waiting for several years to be able to talk about this in a sermon, and I have a captive audience. Are you ready? I want to talk about turn signals. Turn signal. It's a shame that about a decade ago that automakers just disabled all of them on new vehicles, right? To me, and I'm writing this a little large, admittedly, to me, though, it's interesting when we move through life in a way that suggests that we don't need to take care of those traveling near us. That anything that I do in my life, anything that I care about or choose to do, has no impact on anyone else, or if it does, who cares, right? Who cares? I know as a cyclist, how many times have I sat there at a stop sign waiting for a car to tell me what they're going to do, and no, they in fact don't ever, and so I sit there. We've all had that experience. But it's an interesting piece what comes under that. This business of not being concerned about how others move through this life and how we might impact them by our choices or our lack of choosing. In the first reading today, we have the story of Moses receiving the law, and throughout the wide internet, you can find any number of memes on Moses and his 2 tablets coming down the mountain, right? This image, though, of thou shalt not, no, 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 these are all words that we hate today, right? No, I'm free. It's a free country. I can do whatever I want without thought of any consequence to anyone else. Whenever we get to this point, I do like to take just a second, have you grab a red hymnal out of the pew in front of you, and I'd like you to turn to page 1160. And yes, it's very near the back, if that's helpful. If the sermon ever gets slow, reading Luther's Small Catechism is a perfectly acceptable alternative in my book. Maybe not for Pastor Federica, but 1160. Here we have the commandments. Thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. Don't. But if we look at the 5th commandment, you shall not murder. Seems like a good one, right? We ought to have that. That one we should keep for sure. But what I want you to look at is Luther's explanation of that commandment. We are to fear and love God so that we neither endanger nor harm the lives of our neighbors, but instead help and support them in all of life's needs. You can see Luther is taking that much further than simply don't harm them. And notice that the word harm certainly implies physical harm, but not necessarily just that. Are there ways in which we diminish the life of our neighbor? But also the idea that we are to be actively engaged in supporting our neighbor. You can go ahead and put those back. We're not going to read all of them, but you're welcome to. There's just 10, so it's not that hard. So now this image of rules, do not, that's not always the easy for us to hear, right? Some of them are pretty obvious, but others are like, but I'd like to, I want to. We don't think of it in the way in which we impact one another. I'm mindful when I was at camp, working at camp during my college years, we always tried to turn a rule around and say it positively. So if we needed kids to not run at a certain place or time, We didn't scream, "Don't run!" We would say, "Please walk." Something to say it positively. But one of the things that is most important is that everything that underpins the Ten Commandments, everything, is about what it means to live in community in a way that is a blessing for everyone within that community. Several years ago, we went camping at Glacier National Park up in Montana, a beautiful place if you've not been there. And I remember as we were driving around in that area, they have a fascinating passion in that county and state for the Ten Commandments. Billboards everywhere with the list of the Ten Commandments. Magnetic decals slapped to the side of cars with the Ten Commandments. Signs, 4x8 signs on any church property you drove past with the Ten Commandments. Nothing necessarily about Jesus, but they were big on the Ten Commandments. And the best part of it was, sometimes certain commandments were highlighted. Not exactly sure what they were trying to get at, but I remember distinctly getting out of a car to go to a restaurant. We were in the parking lot, and the car next to me had a Ten Commandments magnetic decal on the door, and they had left their laptop on the front passenger seat. I was wondering if it was like a test, right, to see if this was a Ten Commandment believing part of town or not. We sometimes get passionate about rules. Usually, we get passionate about rules that we think our neighbor is not observing as closely as they should be. We're less concerned about rules as they apply to us. Reference the turn signal, right? What does it mean when God calls us to live in certain ways? In modern times, in certain parts of the Christian community, this language has shifted a little bit, perhaps to be more along the lines of, what would Jesus do, right? WWJD, very popular a few years back, this question. But today's gospel text kind of throws a curious twist on that, because making a weapon and driving people out of church is apparently one of the options of what Jesus might do. These rules of life that allow us to drive on roads together, navigate school together, be at work together, many of these things are rules that are written down, maybe not in stone, but written down. Many of the rules are not written down, right? Have you moved into a new community where you kind of have to navigate how certain things are done? You know, maybe you moved to Germany and mowed your lawn on a Sunday morning and suddenly discovered that that's not a thing you do. Or people coming to the United States and finding any number of unwritten rules, as we call them, right? As you seek to learn to be in that place. One of the things about us in community is that every 7 days we gather in this space. In the gospel reading, Jesus and his whip driving people out is not driving them out of a store or the library or some kind of manufacturing facility. The context is the temple. It's happening within the temple. Jesus is very concerned about what is happening in the temple, or perhaps what is not happening in the temple. As people of faith, when we gather in community, we have these rules to help us, that we might gather to do something. And one of the things that I want to leave you with is this word about which we're about right now, the word worship. Now, worship might be a noun in some ways. I'm going to worship. It's an event, a thing, right? you go to it. I went to a play. I went to worship. But in fact, worship is better described as a verb. It's more like to swim, to walk, to read, to worship. It's what we do. It's what we do in this place. It's not in the hymnal, but in the Augsburg Confession, some of the confessional documents of the Lutheran tradition, there was a question asked, kind of, what is the church? Historically, the church had been understood as that place that had the right bishops. So if you had the right bishop, you could know. Or somebody might walk by and say, well, it says on the sign, right? Church. But in the Lutheran confessions, Luther articulated that you had to see what was going on at that place to know if it was church. It is a place where the sacraments are administered rightly, as the confessions say, and where the gospel is preached in its purity. You have to see what's being done. This activity that we are about, the worship of our God as we gather on Sundays, is a reminder to us of the work that we do together. And when human beings are together, we're living life more in the way in which God created us to live. Not alone, driving in a universe where no other human being would possibly need to know which way we're turning. But rather that we are gathered together to do the work of community with all of its rules for all of our benefits, so that we might gather to worship the God who created us, who loves us, who showers grace upon us, so that we might do the same in the world around us. Amen.